Before we begin, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps more people find stories that matter. As you listen, tell me in the comments, in the hardest seasons of history, what would you have done? Follow the rulebook or follow your gut? The sun rose heavy over Texas in the summer of 1944, bright, indifferent, endless. It hammered the coils of barbed wire that ran mile after mile across dry plains where mesquite trees pushed out of cracked soil, and the wind carried the faint smell of oil and dust. Beyond the fences stood long wooden barracks, roofs of tin shimmering with heat, their lines so neat that from a distance you might mistake the place for a training ground or some frontier town reborn in khaki. It wasn't. This was a prison in a country at war. By then, the United States held more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war, Italians, Japanese, and mostly Germans, spread from California to Georgia. The government built over 700 POW camps, far from the front lines, to keep the Reichsmen scattered and contained. Texas alone held more than 60,000 prisoners in places like Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, and Camp Huntsville. The camps were clean and efficiently run. By the brutal standards of a world at war, they were humane. Most prisoners spent their days building roads, chopping wood, picking cotton for a few cents an hour, the wages keeping the war machine supplied. They sang hymns at night, carved chess pieces out of soap, and learned to say thank you in a language that didn't belong to them. And then, something nobody had prepared for. Women arrived. They came in small, quiet groups, rattling past watchtowers on army trucks that had hauled captured personnel from East Coast docks. Some had worked as Luftwaffe auxiliaries, trained to plot radar or type-coded messages. Some were Red Cross volunteers. Some were military nurses bundled toward the front and trapped when it collapsed. They stepped down from trucks with their uniforms stripped of insignia, hair pinned beneath regulation scarves, bodies taut with fatigue. They smiled shyly. They smelled of soap and fear. The American guards didn't know what to do with an enemy who said, "Please." The women were separated, then separated again, quartering them inside fenced compounds within the larger compounds, watched by MPs whose posture mixed curiosity with unease. Orders came fast and hard. No fraternization, no gifts, no shared meals. But war had marooned these women far from home, and orders didn't dissolve loneliness or shame or fear. Some had marched for weeks before capture. Some had lost contact with families in bombed-out towns. Some, though no one said it aloud, were already carrying life inside them. At first, no one noticed. The camp doctor blamed fainting spells and nausea on poor nutrition. A nurse at Camp Hearn wrote in her log one morning that a German woman turned pale at the smell of coffee. It was another nurse, barely 23, new to Army service, who pieced it together. She recognized the halting steps, the trembling hands, the quiet tears after lights out. Her report made its way up through channels like a spark thrown into dry brush. There were no guidelines for pregnant prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, but no one had imagined that mercy would involve bassinets and bottles. Outside the wire, rumors seeped into town like the wind. Some resented the fact that POW camps were clean and orderly, while ration books sat on American kitchen tables, and meat was a memory. Others pitied them, young faces peering through wire. Not so different from their own brothers overseas. Local papers chose their words cautiously. The Army preferred silence. The thought of German women captured in uniform sleeping safely in Texas while American boys bled in Normandy cut at the public conscience like a paper edge you couldn't find. Life went on under Texas skies. Prisoners marched to work in the half-light. Guards circled the perimeter. Dust rose with every boot and settled on everything like a fine brown veil. In the infirmary, slow ceiling fans worked uselessly against the heat, while nurses in white tried to keep patients cool with damp cloths. That was when one of the German women collapsed while scrubbing laundry. They carried her in on a stretcher, her face chalk white, her pulse all over the place. The army doctor examined her, closed his mouth, and muttered that she was 3 months along. Word made its way through the barracks quickly. Some prisoners crossed themselves, others stared at the floor. The young woman, a former Luftwaffe typist of 21, refused to speak for days. What did justice look like now? What did mercy? She was an enemy under the Reich's flag. She was also a patient in their care. Memos flew between the War Department and Geneva. The answer arrived like a sentence carved into stone. Pregnancy shall not alter the humane treatment due under existing convention. In plainer terms, feed her, examine her, protect her. America had signed its name beneath those words. The ink had to be honored. Over the following weeks, other women came forward. Some with halting English whispered into nurses' shadows, others discovered by chance during routine checks. One had sewn her sugar ration into her blanket, saving it for a child she wasn't sure would live. Another begged to write home, "So my mother knows I am not dead." Each confession carried equal measures of guilt and relief. For the nurses, the revelations redrew their work entirely. They had braced for broken bones and trench fevers. They now studied German medical terms at night. Wehen for labor pains, Atmen for breathe, writing them phonetically in notebooks lined with sweat. Camp life shifted, almost imperceptibly. Beds moved closer to the infirmary. Milk rations quietly increased. Guards who used to bark orders suddenly lingered, awkward, unsure how to act around women who would soon have babies. The desert wind blew over everything, barbed wire and hard resolve alike, indifferent to politics or pity. By autumn, the cicadas hushed, the days shortened, and the smell of rain came back to the earth. In the infirmary, labor arrived with a sound no report could capture. A nurse dropped her pen. Another ran for hot water. The doctor, so certain about the field manual, found himself kneeling beside a woman who had been his enemy 3 months before. Official paperwork later reduced the moment to a single sentence: female prisoner delivered of child, condition stable. The guards who heard the infant cry never forgot. Something invisible loosened its grip. The news moved through the camp as fast and quiet as a desert wind. The first German child had been born behind the wire. With it came questions no order could resolve. In the mess hall, men stared at their coffee. In the infirmary, nurses exchanged glances they didn't have words for. Somewhere in Washington, a clerk typed with shaking fingers, "Subject, pregnant prisoners of war. Immediate medical protocols required." At Camp Hearn, the Army Medical Corps converted a storage barrack into what the paperwork called a provisional maternity ward. They cleared out crates of gauze and surplus blankets, scrubbed the walls with carbolic, painted the windows white for privacy. It smelled of pine disinfectant and metal. The floorboards groaned with every step. It was nothing like a hospital wing back home. For the German women within, it would be the safest place they had known since the war began. Second Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, 24, was among the first assigned to the ward. Skinny, serious, trained in Dallas, she'd spent months patching up oil field hands and influenza cases. Nothing had prepared her for this. "We're building a nursery for Nazis," one orderly said, not under his breath. The words landed like blows. Hayes had lost her brother at Anzio 6 months earlier. His photo lived in her pocket, edges worn from her thumb. Yet when she met the terrified blue eyes of the first mother, Liesel, a Luftwaffe typist from Cologne, something yielded inside her that war had not managed to harden completely. Liesel barely spoke English. Fear translates fluently. They built a truce out of small acts, one pouring water, the other whispering thanks. Beneath the hum of a generator, humanity found footholds. Outside, the universe continued on rails. Prisoners lined up at dawn. Guards paced the fence line. The Texas sky remained untroubled by the moral knots below it. Inside the maternity ward, the nurses clung to the Geneva Convention like a psalm. They rationed vitamins from their own supplies, smuggled a slice of bread from the mess, requested fresh linens, knowing that hospitals overseas begged for more. "The regulations say nothing about infants," one sergeant complained. Hayes stared at the form in his hand, until he looked away. "Then we'll write the first line." The births came slowly, each one a small battle of will and quiet. During labor, the women prayed, not for leaders, not for nations, but in the language of pain and hope. Hayes held Liesel's hand through the worst of it, whispering while sweat and tears blurred the uniforms between them. When the baby's cry finally cut through the walls, it startled the whole room. Later, when Hayes wrapped the infant in a white cloth-stamped U.S. Army Medical Department, she glanced up and saw Liesel watching her with tears that ran without sound. For the first time, Liesel didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like every mother Hayes had ever helped, exhausted, afraid, more alive than she'd ever been. Mercy in wartime rarely went unchallenged. A colonel from the 8th Service Command toured the ward, boots heavy on the boards. He frowned at ration logs, muttered something about, "The public won't like this." The women drew their babies close. Hayes didn't blink. "They're under our flag," she said. "That means they're under our care." The colonel took the extra milk allotment forms anyway. For a while, the mothers went without. The town buzzed. Some people called the infants Hitler's angels. Some women from local churches knitted baby socks and slid them to the gate through a chaplain, refusing to give their names. Newspapers said nothing at all. No one wanted a photograph of a German baby being rocked to sleep beneath an American sun. The camp personnel changed in ways that no inspection could quantify. A guard volunteered to take night duty beside the ward because he liked to listen to the soft sounds through the wall. "Reminds me of home," he said, embarrassed. The chaplain started holding quiet evening prayers for all souls, known and unknown. Even Captain Riley, who ran the place like a ledger, stopped outside the ward one evening, hat in hand, staring into lamplight until the cold drove him away. The women wrote letters they weren't sure would cross the ocean. "My child was born among those we called enemies," one scrawled, "but they gave him life. Tell Father not to hate them." Others drew cribs on scrap paper with pencils borrowed from guards. For many, the ward became a paradox. Safety built by those who had captured them. There were miracles, and there were losses. One infant slipped away in a fever that rose too fast. Hayes buried the child herself under a wooden cross with no name, only a number. She set one wild flower on the mound and whispered, "You didn't pick a side." That night thunder rolled for hours, and rain washed the dust clean from the graves. By December, frost glazed the barbed wire like silver thread. Inside, mothers shared blankets with infants and hummed lullabies that even the guards began to recognize. Hayes walked the aisles with a lantern, listening to breath and dreams. She wrote in her journal, "Mercy is a discipline too, harder than obedience." When mail finally came from Europe, some letters brought nothing but ruins. Houses gone, families gone, streets turned to ash. The women folded the papers small and pressed them to their hearts and kept rocking. They had lost almost everything except what they now held. Hayes began to understand that the war's most important front line wasn't overseas. It cut through rooms like this, between vengeance and grace. One night, a jeep rolled into the compound with a sealed envelope. "Confidential," the label read. It was still glowing from the lamp's light when Hayes slid it open and saw the words, "Reassignment pending." The camp would transfer several of the POW mothers and their infants to Camp Swift near Bastrop. Headquarters insisted the new facility was nearer to a hospital. Hayes saw the route, imagined winter and open trucks, and felt her stomach lurch. She argued until her voice was rough. "They won't make it if we don't go with them." The duty officer conceded one nurse. She packed her satchel in silence. Trucks pulled up before sunrise, under a sky the color of tin. Nurses and guards gathered in the cold while engines idled. Inside, mothers sat already awake, clutching their babies. It was supposed to be routine. Nothing about it felt that way. Bassinet's stamped U.S. Army Medical Department looked far too small on the wooden floor of a truck bed. Hayes climbed aboard, closed the canvas, and took a seat between two women. Frost fogged their breath. The engines droned a low lullaby as Texas slid by under wheels. Once, a baby coughed. His mother kissed his forehead and prayed in German until the words ran out and tears finished the sentence. Camp Swift was larger, harder, more severe. It had been built for thousands of men, not a handful of women with infants. They led the convoy through mud to a freshly painted barrack with a Red Cross flag hooked on a nail. Inside, cots ran wall to wall. There were no cribs yet, no bottles, just blankets and a promise. The promise held just. Hayes built a routine out of almost nothing. Feeding schedules scribbled onto the backs of requisitions, bottles sterilized by boiling water in dented pots, medical charts that looked as official as any infantry list. The absurdity of it could have been unbearable, if not for the sound of the babies. 12 by February. Their cries echoed through the boards, like declarations that life does not ask permission. The chaplain baptized some of them with water from his canteen. "I don't know what flag covers a soul," he murmured to Hayes, "but I know what peace sounds like, and it's this." Supplies dwindled. Milk shipments slowed as cargo priorities shifted across the ocean. Hayes watered milk and watered it again. She wrote more letters to headquarters. She got one reply that might as well have been a wall. Resources limited. Proceed with alternatives. So they improvised. Bread, mashed into warm water. Prayers in a room that smelled of cedar and fear. One morning, a young corporal walked into the ward with a crate. "For the babies," he said, setting it down. Inside were jars of strained carrots, labels bright from a grocery back home. "My mother sent them," he muttered, one ear red with embarrassment. The women thanked him with smiles so soft that the room seemed to glow. Somewhere in March, in a different part of Camp Swift, 3 male prisoners made a run at the fence. Alarms turned the night white. Boots hammered the ground. Soldiers stormed every building. Hayes stood with her arms spread at the maternity ward door. "There are infants here," she told them. The captain pointed beyond her, then lowered the muzzle of his rifle. The search moved past. When the ward settled again, one baby's chest had gone too quiet. Hayes worked until sweat dripped from her elbow. She coaxed breath from a body no larger than a loaf of bread. There was a single gasp, and then nothing. The ward buried the child at dawn. They marked the grave with a simple board that read, "Baby 7, born free." Even the hard men took off their hats. The things that changed the most never appeared on a form. Guards whittled toys at night in their bunks, tiny airplanes, horses, blocks, and left them at the ward door. Hayes found one marked with her brother's initials. She kept it by her stethoscope. War raged across oceans and radio waves, but inside the fence line, something else took root. The women started to nod at guards passing. The nurses stopped thinking in enemy and ally. They thought in heartbeats and ounces. Spring softened the edges of everything. Small patches of green crept toward the fence. Train whistles in the distance sounded less like ghosts and more like the future. The babies learned to toddle, little feet slapping boards, laughter bouncing off walls where orders used to. Hayes stood in the doorway each morning, buttoned into a uniform that felt heavier than it looked, and counted them all with her eyes. She knew which baby reached for the light and which one slept like a stone, which one would press small fingers against the metal of her badge as if to measure its weight. The orders, when they came, arrived like weather. The army would begin repatriating prisoners. The war was ending, slowly and by degrees. Reports of Allied advances, news of surrender talks whispered across Europe's ruins. But the words on paper were crisp, all dependents included. As if mercy could be itemized. Crates were packed, medical files were sealed. The women sewed small satchels, one for milk powder, one for baby clothes, one for hope. Guards carved cedar keepsakes, horses, doves, hearts, and slipped them into bundles with a cough to hide the gesture. The chaplain offered a blessing over each child that combined English and Latin into something that sounded like home to no one and comfort to everyone. The convoy rolled east toward Galveston under a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. It took 3 days to reach the port. Liberty ships loomed with their mouths open. At night, Hayes sat near the cargo hold and listened to the breathing of women and children mixed with the creak of steel. She wondered what Europe had left for them. Would they be greeted as survivors or blamed as reminders? The Army's logbooks remained clean. Repatriated to Bremen, May 1946, condition stable. There was no space on a form for fear, gratitude, grief. Back in Texas, the camps emptied, barracks were dismantled, fences came down, signs disappeared. Within a year, wind walked the paths and carried traces of laughter like a rumor. Hayes stayed long enough to help close the infirmary. The room smelled of soap and cedar and memory. In the back cabinet, she found a stack of sketches, crayon drawings of infants wrapped in blankets marked U.S., signed with thin German initials. She pressed her fingers to the paper as gently as if it were somebody's cheek, then folded the drawings and kept them. The story faded into sediment. Official reports reduced the maternity ward to a footnote. Newspapers never printed a photograph. Nobody put up a plaque. But the traces remained in Texas archives, birth certificates with German names, nurses' ledgers noting deliveries in neat penmanship, a few pictures taken by a curious sergeant with a borrowed camera. In one, a nurse cradled a newborn while a mother cried and smiled at the same time. The caption was a line of ink and a date. April 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. Decades later, historians would find that line and shake their heads. Mercy, it turned out, had built itself a home inside a fence. Before she left the service in 1947, Margaret Hayes drove back to where Camp Hearn had been. Prairie grass leaned in the wind. Concrete foundations held their square like bones. She found the spot where the infirmary had stood and closed her eyes. She could still hear the generator hum, the lullabies sung in a language she couldn't speak, the first cry that had cut through the machinery of war. She thought about the children who had scattered across continents, grown up unaware that they had once shared a birthplace under wire and watchtowers. She knelt, pressed her hand to the earth, and whispered, "You lived. That's enough." Church bells carried faintly from town, and sunlight broke through clouds like a benediction. She stood and walked back to her car. Years later, when someone asked her what she remembered most about the war, she didn't say Anzio or victory parades. She talked about a wooden barrack in Texas, and a night she heard the first cry of a German child and realized that the word enemy had no place there. "We fought a war," she said, "but mercy won one of its own." The children born behind the wire became a quiet symbol. They proved that even when the world is engineered to divide, kindness can cross boundaries without a passport. Their mothers had arrived as prisoners and departed as witnesses to something the war had failed to kill. That life, when given freely, doesn't belong to one side. In the National Archives, there's a thin record from 1945. The ink has faded. All infants healthy. mothers repatriated successfully. Beneath it, in a nurse's hand, an unauthorized note remains. May they never know fences. Half prayer, half promise. The war ended. Mercy, once awake, didn't bother to check the borders. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that compassion changes everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. And tell me below, what would you have done inside those walls?